So hello there. My name's Luke Kay. This is Chris Vincent, and we're here between rounds today to fill you in case you've not been playing much Standard lately, on how the format's progressed and what's been going on in the past few months of Standard. We're jumping straight in at the release of the set of Shadows over Innistrad, the most recent set to enter into Standard, and we're going to do a little bit of a discussion about what happened in the run-up to this event and then immediately afterwards. So, Chris, let's talk about the run-up to the release of Shadows over Innistrad. What are we playing in Standard, and what did we lose with rotation?
All right, so yeah, out with the old and in with the new. So, the previous sets, the sets that rotated, Khans of Tarkir and Fate Reforged. Khans of Tarkir is very much a multicoloured format, multicoloured sets, based around 5 Khans that were used the colours of the enemy coloured wedges, so to speak. They facilitated a lot of multicoloured cards that played some key roles in the format. Before we go into the cards, I just want to talk about how the mana bases in the sort of the previous Standard, as it were, were very, very important because they were very, very powerful.
Sure, mana bases fueled the archetypes that we heard, archetypes like Mardu Green, Jet Sky Black. These were big decks in the format that were playing 4 colour and 5 colour. We haven't seen that in Standard for a while, and since rotation, we probably won't see that again. So yeah, that's an important part.
That's right, and those 4 colour mana bases were enabled by the combination, by combining the battle lands, which we are retaining, with fetch lands, the ability to use a land to fetch the land that you need, use a more generic land to fetch a land that has either types of mana.
Sure. Some
fetch lands ended up potentially getting you 4 colours because a fetch land that gets a forest or plains can get a plains island or a swamp island.
Yeah, this is an engine we see
like
this is an engine we see in Modern and in Legacy, and something that's probably too powerful for Standard, and of course rotates out here with Khans and Fate Reforged rotating.
Yeah.
They enabled a lot of the decks, as we talked about, Mardu Green, Jet Sky Black, and as we were talking, the Khans wedges facilitate this as well with the cards that are now rotating out there. So if we look at the wedges individually, we can see, like, for instance, Abzan. What do we lose from Abzan, Chris?
So Abzan was a key player in the meta game. It won Pro Tour Battle for Zendikar, and the curve of Warden of the First Tree turn 1, pump that Warden turn 2, turn 3, Anaphins of the Foremost, green, black, white, Siege Rhino, 1, green, black, white. Proved to be sort of a fatal curve for many opponents.
You're not losing that game,
yeah. Well, you either had it or you didn't, and on balance, most opponents didn't have enough to handle that. One of the other Khans, Jeskai, my favourite combo, blue, white, red. It lost a key multicoloured card in Mantis Rider. That was a very sort of cheap, fast threat that the Jeskai deck was able to use to sort of tip opponents off balance, backing it up with either removal or counter spells. So very much a sort of a traditional fish style deck potentially, and yeah, you mentioned these decks sort of like Mardu Green and Jeskai Black. So Jeskai Black was one of the decks that was put on the map by John Finkel and Owen Turtenwald at Pro Tour Battle for Zendikar. Unfortunately, didn't quite get there, but it proved to be a popular choice due to its versatility. But we probably won't be seeing any more of that because of the mana base issue we discussed earlier, and the removal of its key threat, Mantis Rider. Another card I wanted to talk about from the Jeskai clan actually is Jeskai Ascendancy.
Yes.
So that was a card.
It spawned a whole archetype onto itself. It was a combo deck. As its journey through Standard progressed, the combo deck changed slightly, but a one card archetype is fascinating, and unfortunately here rotating.
Yeah. It's rotated out. The deck's probably not happening without it.
Probably not.
Other cards that made an impact that we're going to not see anymore are the Delve cards. So I'm talking mostly about Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time. Those were really, really powerful cards that have been banned in Eternal formats on power level reasons, roughly. But they really helped play a role in a range of decks that were quite ubiquitous. So they allowed control decks to take control of games, as they do, with card advantage and improved card selection. But they also allowed mid-range decks to sort of keep up with those control decks, gave them versatility to address aggressive or controlling problems that they were facing. And even some of the more aggressive decks themselves were able to use these cards to continue piling on the pressure or backing up their threats.
Or punch through the last points of damage.
finding 2 more burn spells with your dig through time, or sort of drawing 3 cards was sometimes enough to sort of bury an opponent when they were on the back foot.
So the other delve cards we had, not just the blue ones, there were popular black delve cards too, weren't there?
Oh yeah, so 2. I'm glad you mentioned that, because 2 other delve cards in Murderous Cut and Task of the Golden Fang proved to be quite ubiquitous across the format. So Murderous Cut, destroy target creature. Almost all the decks had creatures, many of which warranted killing, and the ability to just have a flat out answer to that, potentially at the cost of 1 black mana, because the longer the game goes, or the more cards you just end up getting in your graveyard. And we keep coming back to this, but those fetch lands put cards in your graveyard and facilitated a potential turn 2, turn 3 Murderous Cut pretty easily for the cost of 1 mana. And Task of the Golden Fan, similar principle in that you could have a relatively cheap threat. 4/5 was quite a good size. It certainly made a Siege Rhino bounce, it buffered a Siege Rhino, so to speak. But also it had an ability that fueled future delve and provided additional card advantage. Going to the other side of the spectrum, moving away from maybe the more mid-range control decks, one of the more powerful cards in the format at the time was Monastery Swiftspear.
Yeah, spawning the red mono-red archetype.
So the beast that is mono-red aggro. And Monastery Swiftspear was a very important role player in that. It's probably one of the more powerful red aggressive cards we've seen over time. Without that card, I do sort of have questions about what kind of threats can replace it to a sufficient level to enable sort of a cheap red aggressive deck to thrive in the same way that the red deck did during the Khans era. For instance, it won Pro Tour Battle for Zendikar, but part of that is not only due to Monastery Swiftspear, but also the Team of Battle Rage combo played a role in securing that Pro Tour victory for Martin Dime.
Another card that rotates, Team of Battle Rage.
Team of Battle Rage and Become Immense. They're all going. So will we see? People?
That's a total overhaul of mono red archetype, an archetype that's traditionally quite popular, throughout standard formats in the past.
Yeah, so we'll have to see. People were worrying, about what can I play a red deck in the new standard? So with the loss of that, odds weren't as good. The last sort of key pillar that I think people were worried maybe not worried because it dominated the format so much towards the end of as it was coming to a close. But the card Rally the Ancestors,
sure,
similar in the way you described Jeskai Ascendancy, was a namesake card of a deck that had a shell based around getting lots of creatures into play and triggering those enters the battlefield and leaves play or dies triggers. And Rally the Ancestors was a card that allowed you to get them all back from your graveyard and really put the nail in the coffin and have that combo finish to a deck with a lot of moving parts. So some people will be quite glad to see that card go.
Well, yeah.
But we'll have to see what kind of decks that play a similar role.
So interestingly, it's slightly different to the way we discussed Jeskai Ascendancy in that Rally the Ancestors leaves behind a shell of many cards that we discussed that originally sort of Nantuko Husk, Zulaport Cutthroat that still exist, and so providing brew space there for another card to come in, perhaps through Shadows or Innistrad, and sort of take up the shell and maintain the archetype. So it's not dying such a death as Jeskai Ascendancy, but providing a different angle for players to look to brew and build on, which is interesting, and I think isn't something that we could mourn as much as look to change and edit. Finally, there's a few more linchpins, I believe.
Yeah. Just to finish off, some of the cards that were maybe just a shade less ubiquitous than when we mentioned the Delve cards. Wingmate Rock card that I think is close to a lot of players' hearts, myself included. I played a lot of Wingmate Rocks. Yeah. 2 big creatures in one card is always pretty good.
Good value.
When they've got flying and potential life gain.
Compared to Baneslayer Angel, this card, which is in the past big form.
I think it's quite a different card. But yeah, the ability to just kill a lot of planeswalkers and a lot of opponents. So that's one that I'm sure a lot of players will miss. Ugin, Ugin was a really, really powerful card that's going. It really spelt game over for a lot of the more aggressive decks. The ability to just 8 mana wipe everything from existence, or if you didn't have much going on, just lightning bolt you until an inevitable ultimate. We're not going to see, I don't know whether we will see a replacement card that is capable of eliminating multiple Planeswalkers, enchantments, creatures from the battlefield in one foul swoop. Another card I wanted to mention, Hordling Outburst, played a role in the red deck, in the tokens deck, and also in some of the mid-range decks like Mardu, where having a card that presents a bit of advantage against spot removal was quite useful to have. And lastly, Whisperwood Elemental was a card that sort of entered the fray as some kind of card that develops the board and stabilizes against wraths. The last, actually, that reminds me, one other card I did want to mention was the sort of the one-sidedness of Crux of Fate in that Esper Dragons deck. I'm wondering whether Esper Dragons, how much of a future it has without a card as advantageous for it as that. I just thought it was worth mentioning as well. So,
sure. So that's a lot of cards to lose on rotation. The format's going to change massively, but we won't want it too long as we've got this exciting new set, Shadows of Innistrad, rotating in, and that brings with it new cards and exciting new cards. So with the spoiler out, there were lots of hype around specific cards. What do you think, Chris? What were your big things to pull out?
So yeah, when the full spoiler came out, obviously people's eyes are immediately drawn towards like these big mythic, rare. Often the Planeswalkers are the ones that really people look at, wondering whether they'll fit in. So we've got we've got Nahiri, Sorin, Arlincord, and Jace.
Big Planeswalkers, big parts of the story, cards close to players' hearts.
So I'm not, people were wondering whether Nahiri would work. What kind of creatures you can use its ultimate to find. We'll just have to see how that sort of pans out as we look at
I know a lot of players had a lot of fun brewing with these cards.
Arlincord, another card that people were wondering whether it would work. I think someone asked me straight away, does that card just make 3 wolves and do 9 damage when it comes into play? And because it's a sort of a transform card, and they were wondering whether they could activate the ability each side that makes it transform again. But I don't think that's the case.
Well, we're on the point of transform cards. Moving on through this, obviously, Innistrad, a lot of flavorful mechanics there. Transform was a popular one that's been in the past. Have we got anything new from that mechanic that's coming?
So yeah, transform. The poster child for transform, I think Arlincord was probably overtaken slightly, pipped to the post by Archangel Avacyn. So 5 mana, a Serra Angel with flash that makes all my creatures come into play with indestructible. And then if one of my creatures dies, I get an even bigger, badder threat that destroys potentially my opponent's board. That's a pretty good deal, I think, and I think a lot of people will be excited. Were really excited about that card when it sort of was spoiled. Another transform card, the transform. So it's Thing in the Ice is the card I'm talking about. A 0/4 when it comes into play, and the condition to meet in order to transform it into its other side. It's a bit harder, so it comes into play with 4 ice counters, and you have to play an instant or sorcery to remove an ice counter, and then only when all 4 ice counters are removed can you transform it into the Awoken Horror. But boy, is it worth it. You get a huge threat that bounces, I think it returns all non-horror creatures to your opponent's hand, so unless your opponent is playing Tribal Horrors, you're going to have a clean break and be able to get in with a big Gribbly monster. So that's been...
So there's some big transform cards, but do they stand up well to the transform cards we already had in the format? The biggest one being, of course, Jace Vryn's Prodigy, a card that was actually hyped quite a lot in the spoiler of this set, even though it's not in the set, and partially because of another one of the mechanics that we've seen in Shadows of Innistrad, Madness. So Jace's ability, draw a card, then discard a card, and with Madness coming in the set, as you mentioned, that's an implicit synergy straight away. So looking at what Madness cards are kind of good... It was something that a lot of people did as soon as the spoiler came out. Immediately, oh my gosh, we need to brew around this interaction between Jace and Madness. And I think there's a lot of interesting brew space there.
So the immediate one to pick out that consequently got a lot of spoiler hype is Fiery Temper.
Yeah.
So kind of like a lightning bolt.
Lightning bolt with upside, right? With Jason play.
Well, that's just advantage really, because you just draw it's lightning bolt, draw a card.
It is.
If it's got Jason, you can pay for it. So that's obviously one that people got wet people's appetites, as it were. The other madness cards, I'm not quite so sure. A lot of them seem to be like creatures that you have a reduction in mana cost. And they're sort of probably more favoured in the limited environment as opposed to standard strategy. But having said that, a lot of the vampires seem to have madness synergy.
So we discussed tribal horrors, tribal vampires. I know, slightly jokingly, but tribal was a set, an idea that ran through this set, and again got people thinking, got people excited.
Yeah, tribal vampires, I'd be a bit more serious about as opposed to tribal horrors. But people were wondering, will vampires be a thing? Will vampires not? There's a sort of a card. I think it's Olivia. It's the new Olivia, but she has an ability with respect to like discarding cards and potentially turning in those magic.
And we got the first 1-mana red 2/1 with upside. Before the set, there had never been a 1-mana red 2/1 without a downside, so that's quite a big step.
Yeah, it's great on turn 1, but I'm not sure about in standard.
We discussed Monastery Swiftspear. I mean, possibly not a direct replacement there, but tribal vampires are something definitely that whet people's appetites early on. But moving away from madness, we saw some other mechanics in the set as well.
So yeah, the one I really like is investigate. I can't get away from the fluff even when I'm trying to be really strategic about standards. So investigate is where a spell has an effect and it creates a clue token, which is an artifact that you can sack for 2 generic mana, and then when the person who sacrifices the clue gets to draw a card.
Incredibly flavourful, yeah.
Well, yeah, the first card I want to talk about, I quite like the artwork. It's got it's called Declaration. The card's Declaration in Stone, and I think it's about when Jace tries to pick up some clues.
A Mark of Mana.
A Mark of Mana. So I see you've been looking into this too. You like the fluff too.
The fluff.
So, and then there's like a load of vampires all sort of entrenched in stone. And as the mana's gone a bit haywire. Anyway, the card exiles a creature and all of the creatures with the same name. And for each
2-mana removal spell in standard, probably going to be a big role player and immediately pulled out by players.
Well, that's important. We talked about a destroy target creature spell leaving standard. A new exile target creature and all creatures with the same name is going to potentially be a reasonable replacement for that. Slight drawback in that for each creature you remove that wasn't a token, the controller of that creature gets a clue. So it's kind of like Path to Exile or Swords to Plowshares in all the format, where you get to flat out remove a creature with your white mana, but the opponent seems to get compensated in some way.
Sure.
For this. However, it does say non-tokens, so you can actually target your opponent's tokens, and all tokens disappear, and they don't actually get any clues. But I think that's going to be quite an interesting one based on the premise we just discussed about sort of the necessity for removal, seeing as standard's quite a creature-based format.
Yeah, the second Investigate card, of course,
is a creature, and that is a Tireless Tracker. So this is a 3/2, and every time you play a land, so it's weird. People are making the sort of blurring the lines here, and it's effectively got landfall, make a clue. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, you get a clue. And then, whenever you investigate, whenever you crack a clue, and it doesn't have to be, it's not limited to just the clues that you've created with the Tireless Tracker.
Yeah.
You can have a Tireless Tracker in play. If your opponent declarations in stone another creature, I don't know why they wouldn't declaration the Tireless Tracker. So you've got a big Gribbly Dragon. Any clue you crack means that the Tireless Tracker gets +1 counter and grows, and that just creates this return on investment over time as the match progresses.
Yeah, I mean, drawing cards and playing lands are things that you want to be doing in Magic anyway, so doing those things with Tireless Tracker in play is just getting an extra value. Moving on, like Delirium, another mechanic we see entering Shadows Innistrad, possibly a bit more quirky, slightly different, more of an off-on mechanic that we've seen in the past, like Metalcraft or Chroma. What do you think to that?
I think so. Delirium is, in my mind, very similar to like the old Threshold mechanic that was available, I think, in Odyssey block, where your creature or your spell did something, and then if you had Threshold, if you had this condition, your spell was better.
Yeah, it did an extra thing. Yeah.
So Delirium is where you have 4 different card types in your graveyard. Among the various card types, so enchantment, land, creature, sorcery, instant, artifact, so on and so on. So I think these are cards that get better as the game progresses, because the longer the game goes on, the higher chance you have of having force-removed cards in your graveyard. So the 2 cards I've chosen to focus on are Mindrag Demon. So that's a 4/5 flyer for 4 mana.
Very popular in the spoiler. One of the earliest cards spoiled for the set, appearing in the dual decks. Something that people immediately picked out as a big role player, a possible big role player in Standard. What do you think, Chris?
Well, I can see why people thought that, because of its Enter the Battlefield ability, where you get to put cards from your library into your graveyard, therefore enabling Delirium, and your Delirium enabler happens to be a big scary threat with flying. It's interesting. The Delirium, it is a Delirium card in the sense that it has Delirium. If you don't have Delirium, you lose 2 life, essentially. So it sort of tries to fulfill its own prophecy, and will work out whether you're paying you end up paying the price for the power, I guess. But yeah, big flying threats are generally really good in Standard. We talked about Wingmate Rock, we talked about Avacyn. So
we've seen other ones in the past.
I think people have been speculating that a lot as a big an aggressive card, and also as a combo enabler. So we'll just have to see. The other Delirium card I did want to mention, though, also is Traverse the Uvenwald. So 1 mana, go get a basic land, put it in your hand. It's fairly straightforward.
Lay of the land, we've seen it before.
But have you heard about what happens when you have Delirium?
Chris, tell me more.
So when you have Delirium, instead of just getting basic land, you can look for any creature or any land.
Demonic Tutor. We're Demonic Tutoring in Standard.
Well, you can't get your second Traverse the Uvenwald and tutor for a tutor for a tutor for a tutor, but you can get either, if you need that 10th land to cast Ulamog, or Ulamog himself if you've got 10 lands. It provides that tutor ability, which is obviously going to... People are speculating on how powerful that will be as the format evolves. There are also a lot of sort of more, less... cards that are less tied to these mechanics that I just wanted to mention that have picked up a lot in a lot of attention as people speculated on the spoiler. So people noticed that there were a lot of aggressive white cards that had some obvious synergies, power. The main 2 culprits I'm talking about are Always Watching. So this is basically a Glorious Anthem, but it says non-token creatures get +1/+1 and Vigilance.
There's the excellent Rich Hagan pun of it. It's tangible virtue.
Because the intangible one only works with tokens, does it?
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that one, but thanks for sharing that one. I'm sure the audience really appreciate that.
Credit to Rich Hagan. Yeah, it's
And then Thalia's Lieutenant as well. So this is a 2 mana 1/1, but when it enters the battlefield, you get to put +1/+1 counter on all other humans, and whenever you play a human, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So imagine just playing multiple Thalia's Lieutenants.
Seems very powerful.
And then playing always watching and giving them more vigilance. It's pretty much a no-brainer in terms of.
I mean, we talked about Horror Tribal, we talked about Vampire Tribal. This is Human Tribal, and this is this was most certainly not a sleeper during the spoiler season. People were pointing out that these cards are this inbuilt synergy, and we're looking forward to brewing and trying out decks with. Exploiting that synergy.
Thalia's Lieutenant I would compare to a card from the previous Innistrad, Champion of the Parish.
Sure.
So that was a 1/1 for 1, and whenever you played whenever a human entered the battlefield, you got to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So it's kind of like that, but it's got that alternative mode, whereas if you draw it late on in the game, you can just pump your whole team.
Yeah.
So I think what they're trying to do is, a lot of the cards we're seeing are maybe ending up less linear and more well-rounded, whether you end up using them in the early game or the late game. So that's my take on how people have looked at the set as the spoiler comes in, and those, I think, are the cards that generated the most hype, or the ones that people wanted to watch out for at the set's inception.
Excellent. So without mourning for too long, we've discussed a quick overview of what's rotating for you guys at home, and a quick overview of what's cropping up. So we hope that's helped you think about the Standard season and the run-up, and we'll be back later to talk more about the Standard decks as the format matures and metagame develops. We'll see you shortly.
Thanks.
Thank you.